The following program has been funded in part through grants from the Exchange Bank Corporation, Incorporated, the Saunders Foundation, the David Falk Foundation, Tampa Electric Company, Port Sutton, Incorporated, the Tampa Tribune and the Tampa Times, the First National Bank of Florida, Tampa Armature Works, Incorporated, and Poe and Associates, Incorporated.
I'm Tony Pizzo, and this is my good friend Joyce Hartman, the producer of this series on the history of Tampa. In these 10 episodes, Joyce and I will show you some of the people, places, and events of the past which have made Tampa the city it is today. You know, Joyce, Tampa history is my hobby. I got into it by accident many years ago when the Cuban government asked me to do some research on several historical markers. I was interviewed by a reporter, and I told him that I had done enough research that I could actually write a book. The next day I read in the paper that I was writing a book. This really put me on the spot, so I felt that I had to do it. Tampa Town, the cracker village with a Latin accent, was the result. So once you write a book, everybody thinks you're an expert, and I had to really start digging into the past in order to live up to that reputation.
Tony, you do your digging in libraries and museums, looking for photographs, records, and old maps. But we know that those date only as far back as the 1500s, and that for almost 10,000 years, people have lived and died along the banks of the Hillsborough River and Tampa Bay. It takes another kind of digging to unearth the story of those prehistoric people, and the only way we can know about them is through the work of archaeologists and anthropologists. Dr. Ray Williams, who teaches at the University of South Florida, is one of these scholarly treasure hunters.
Archaeology is a science that deals with people who are no longer living. There are several types of archaeologists. Some archaeologists work at historic sites, and you might find them at Fort Brooke in downtown Tampa. Some work underwater and might be excavating a shipwreck site in the Florida Keys, and some archaeologists work at prehistoric sites. I think the two most commonly asked questions of archaeologists when people visit sites are, first, how did you know that a site existed? And second, how did you know where to dig within the site? Usually, scattered throughout the surface area of a site are stone artifacts or chert flakes, stone flakes such as this. This indicates that people inhabited the area, and the stone is actually the residue of this habitation. As far as the second question is concerned, how did you know where to dig? It usually depends on the purpose of the archaeologist. If they're interested in burial patterns, they may be digging only where the burials are located. If they're interested in houses, they might be digging only where the houses were located at the site. If they're interested in general information from the site, then they may put the excavation units in any area. This particular site was excavated in the summer of 1978 by students under the supervision of graduate student David McCullough. I think if there is any word which characterizes what archaeologists do or what archaeology is about, that word is control. Control tells us where to dig, how to dig, and even what sort of instruments to use when we're digging. For example, we're digging in squares. The squares are each numbered independently, and the material from each square is kept separately. We also dig in levels from each square, and the material from each level of each square is kept separate. This is because we recognize the fact that the material in the lower levels is older than the material in the upper levels. We use certain types of tools in archaeology. For example, the most commonly used tool is the small triangular trowel. It's sharpened and it cuts through roots and is best to use for clearing the floor or the walls of the excavated square. We also use tools like the large shovel. Although it looks cumbersome, students can, with a small amount of training, do some very delicate archaeological work with it. Other tools consist of whisk brooms, use folding rules. These are in metric because our excavations are conducted in metric. We use the small paint brushes when the material has to be carefully brushed off and cleared before it's removed. And we even use dental picks when the excavated material is very fragile or delicate, such as bone. We've traced the occupation of man in West Florida back to about 10,000 years ago, although this particular site, based on the type of archaeological materials or artifacts that we found, dates somewhere between 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. The last prehistoric manifestation in the Tampa Bay area is that of the Timucua and the Calusa. The Timucua occupied North Florida and even a great deal of the Panhandle area. We know that they were horticulturalists, that they grew maize, squash, and several other domesticated plants. In fact, this seashell was an agricultural instrument. It's been drilled through and it was hafted with a stick larger than this and used as a hoe in the fields. We also know that they hunted deer. In fact, there is a great deal of deer bone found in these sites. Some think that deer may have been the most important food resource that they had. We think that they also hunted alligator, since the remains of alligator are found in the sites with perhaps 24 other species of animals. We think that they also have fortified villages with wooden palisades built around the villages, and that the chiefs of the village pretty well controlled the economic, the social, the political, and religious entities of people's lives. The Calusa occupied the area from the Tampa Bay south, and perhaps the Keys. We know less about them than we do the Timucua. We don't think that agriculture or horticulture was as important to them, and most of the remains that we have are from the Key Marco site, where they discovered wooden artifacts consisting of figurines, masks, totems, and other objects very well preserved, indicating that they were highly skilled artisans. The Timucua and the Calusa, like the other prehistoric inhabitants of Florida, left numerous mounds as evidence of their occupation of the area. The unique thing about the archaeology of the Tampa Bay region is that the border between the two tribes is somewhere nearby.
Early in the 16th century, while the Timucuas and the Calusas were innocently going about their daily lives, an event took place which would eventually cause their complete destruction, one which would change forever the face of the globe.
It was Easter week in 1513 when Juan Ponce de Leon planted the flag of Spain in the sand and named this land Pascua Florida, Easter of the flowers. Later historians would suggest that Ponce was looking for the fountain of youth, but he was really looking for wealth and power. On his first voyage, a voyage of discovery, it is believed that he sailed up as far as the mouth of Tampa Bay.
Now, Tony, you know that he may have been looking for the fountain of youth, because a whole group of Cuban Indians, according to Fontaneda, who wrote an account much later, told about these Indians come over here and jumping into all the springs and lakes and rivers around here. In fact, there was a settlement made for these Cuban Indians.
Well, maybe Ponce, after all, was looking for the fountain of youth. It is said that he was getting to the age where he was more of a lamb than a lion in the boudoir, so who knows? This is my friend, Dr. James W. Covington, one of the eminent historians on Florida history, author of many books, and professor at the University of Tampa teaching history.
Now, Tony, Ponce made 2 trips to Florida, one in 1513, which he may have come to these shores, and the second trip was in 1521, where he made a settlement down probably near Charlotte Harbor, in which he is attacked by the Indians, mortally wounded, and died in Cuba, and is buried in Puerto Rico. And now we're about ready for our second Spanish explorer to come to these shores.
Pablo de Narvaez.
Oh, yes. He will come here with a group of 300 or 400 men in 1528. They'll land on a little island out in the bay and then go to the mainland. The only account of this whole expedition was written by Cabeza de Vaca. They mistreat the Indians, and the Indians will hide in various spots, but several will be captured and their ears cut off and so forth.
Pablo de Narvaez was really a ruthless conquistador. He was a tall, strong, red-headed Spaniard, wore a patch in his eye. He had lost his eye in Mexico, and he was one of the conquerors of the island of Cuba. Actually, he's the first Indian fighter in American history.
You know, Tony, on the banks of the Hillsborough River, right here in Plant Park, is the one monument to these very gallant Spanish gentlemen. They stayed in this area for a short time and then got on horseback and made their way up to Tallahassee. They killed the horses there and made boats from the horse hide and set sail in the Gulf of Mexico. They wrecked off the coast of Louisiana, where 1 or 2 survivors made their way ashore, Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban, a black man, and he stayed among the Indians of Texas for about 8 years. Then they were rescued by people from Mexico, taken down to Mexico City.
That's interesting. In other words, Pablo de Narvaez was drowned in the Gulf of Mexico, and the 3 survivors walked from Tampa Bay to Mexico City for a period of about 8 years.
Right.
There's another little story connected with this expedition. When they landed at Tampa Bay, they had brought their wives on shipboard. And as they were getting ready to return, they were waving to their husbands goodbye. And the ladies talked to each other, and they said, well, I guess we can kiss them goodbye because we'll never see them again. We might as well look for new husbands.
Yeah, but one determined woman just didn't want that to happen. She wanted to see her husband, but that's another story. As you know, there's very little communication between Cuba and the Florida coast. But still, one wife, Mrs. Narvaez, worried about her husband. So she decided to send out a small expedition to find out what was happening to Papa. So the boat will leave Havana and sail along the Florida coast, and the sailors see a stick with a piece of paper on it. So 2 young men say, we're going to go out and grab it and get a reward from Mrs. Narvaez. But the captain says, no, those Indians are going to kill you. It's just a trap. But the 2 young men, one was Juan Ortiz, go to the shore, and just like the captain said, 1 man is killed, and the second one, Juan Ortiz, is captured by the Indians.
Juan Ortiz was dragged to the encampment, and there the Indian chief, Hirahigua, when he saw the Spaniard, he went wild. He immediately wanted to execute him because he couldn't get over the thought that they had cut his nose off and they had thrown his mother to the dogs. And so immediately he says, we're going to roast Juan Ortiz. And they set up a grill, and as soon as the fire started blistering his skin and the smoke was beginning to smell of flesh all over the place, why the little Indian girl, the chief's daughter, came running up to her father, pleaded to please spare him. So they took him off the grill, and they brought him back to good health after a while, the Indian chief's daughter and mother.
Tony, doesn't that give rise to the John Smith Pocahontas story?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, I think that's the basis of the John Smith Pocahontas story.
All right.
So after that, Juan Ortiz actually went native.
Yes.
And for about 11 years, he lived among the Indians, and until DeSoto came along, and
started liberating them.
Yes,
Yes.
they thought he was an Indian. They were getting ready to spear him, and he hollered Santiago, and that was the end of that.
All right. And then DeSoto had come in from Spain, and of course he had to stop in Cuba in order to get fresh horses because all these horses died on the trip. So he stays in Cuba for close to a year and to get some fresh horses, and then we'll sail from Havana. We'll sail up the Florida coast and land. Now, a group of people around 1939 under Dr. Swanton determined that he landed at near Bradenton. But, when I tell the students in Florida history that, there's someplace along Tampa Bay or someplace along the shore.
No one really knows where he actually landed.
That's it. But anyway, he will land here with a fairly large expedition, go ashore, and they can't find any Indians because of the way Narvaez had treated these Indians.
Right.
That's it. But they will liberate Ortiz.
But he was very lucky because Ortiz became his guide and interpreter and stayed with the expedition until they got to Arkansas, and he was drowned, crossing one of the rivers with a heavy mail he was wearing.
You're a native here. What about that DeSoto oak?
Oh, the DeSoto oak. Well, there's a legend here that Hernando DeSoto had parlayed with the Indians under the oak tree, but actually, that tree's not that old. It couldn't possibly be that old. What do you think, Dr. Covington?
That's right. We have pictures when it was a very young tree.
In 1549, Father Cancer de Barbastro came into Tampa Bay with a very small boat and about a handful of clergymen.
Yeah.
The plan was to Christianize the Indians and reap souls for the church. But their captain really double-crossed them because he wanted to be landed on the east coast of Florida, and Captain Araña, whose name was Araña, brought him into Tampa Bay. He knew the Indians were very, very fierce in this area. And they warned him, some of the crew members warned him, don't land. And of course, in the crew was a young lady by the name of Magdalena. She was the interpreter, had lived in Mexico, had learned the English language, the Spanish language, rather, and she had actually become a Christian. But she was the first one to land, and no sooner she went ashore, she disappeared. And Father Cancer thought that everything was fine, so he landed against all the objections of the other members, and no sooner he landed on the shores of the bay, he kneeled, he planted the cross, he kneeled on the sands of the shore, and started praying, and immediately he was clubbed to death. A little later on, the crew members saw Magdalena running naked. She had gone native along the shores, and so they just disappeared, and that was the end of the expedition till, of course, we know that the next expedition into Tampa Bay was Pedro Menendez.
That's right. Pedro founded St. Augustine in the year 1565, and then he decided to come over in this area hunting for his son. So he'll land near Fort Myers and have an encounter with the Coosa Indians in that area. You remember that?
There's quite an interesting episode tied up with that. The Chief Carlos, in dealing the peace treaty with the Spaniards, offered his sister, who also was his wife, to Pedro Menendez, and Pedro Menendez was trying to, squirm out of it, and with the pretext of, well, she's not a Christian, I can't marry her. And the chief says, well, you take her with you, and when she becomes Christianized, then you'll marry her. So Pedro Menendez took her on board and took her all the way to Havana, and they schooled her, but Pedro Menendez never, she was so ugly, he would never have anything to do with her.
As you know, then Pedro liberated one Spaniard who later on wrote an account. The name of the Spaniard was Fontaneda, and he listed some of the Coosa Indian villages right near there. But one historian sort of misinterpreted what he had written and puts this Indian village not near Fort Myers, but up in this area. And the name was written by Fontaneda was T-A-N-P-A. Well, this historian calls it T-A-M-P-A, Tampa.
So that's how we get our name.
That's how we get the name. And then Menendez will come up here, and the place he'll land, the Indian name had Tocobaga, but we believe it's at Safety Harbor.
That's right.
So we have a period then, after the visit of Menendez to this area, a sort of a period of benign neglect, in which the Indians get the white man's disease, smallpox, measles, mumps, and the common cold, and will die, or, as you know, they will be taken as slaves back to other areas. So we don't really know what happened to our Indians of Florida. So the Creek Indians that lived up in Georgia, when they move into Florida, they become known as the Seminoles, and they come in this area and hunt for deer and take the skins on back to the northern part of Florida. And then the English come in. And Tony, how did we get the name of Hillsborough?
Well, during the English period, Bernard Romans came into the Bay Area and surveyed this whole section. And during the time, of course, he was trying to butter up his boss,
Yes.
the Secretary of the Colonies, Lord Hillsborough,
Yeah.
and named the river
This beautiful
at
river
Plant
here?
Park,
Yeah,
right, Hillsborough River. Of course, he named the bay Hillsborough Bay. And we have the maps of Bernard Romans, and the English actually, even though they were only 20 years in the area, they made an impact on our history when it comes to names.
Europeans came here looking for treasure and found little, meanwhile decimating the native population. But what they left behind, either as refuse or in trade, has become contemporary treasure. These artifacts are from a collection found in central Florida, not far from Hillsborough County. The owner tells us that they have never before been publicly displayed. They date from as far back as the 1500s, and most were uncovered from what the owner believes to have been a Timucuan burial mound. This skull was found in close proximity to the other objects displayed, and it was part of the custom of the native tribes that such should be done. The objects belonging to a person would be interred with him. One interesting thing is that the tools that belonged to the dead person were often broken on purpose so that the spirit of the tools would accompany the spirit of their owner. These three metal objects are parts of tools brought from Europe, and you can see a tomahawk head, a Spanish axe, and this hand adze through which a piece of wood, perhaps a tree branch, was hafted. This allowed them to hollow out dug-out canoes, and you can imagine the excitement of the natives to have the use of metal after so many generations of using bone, shell, wood, or stone. These beads were brought precisely for trading from Europe, and if you look very carefully, you can see small pieces of metal interspersed among the glass beads. These pieces of metal were beaten, either they were silver or other metals, and used as ornaments for the natives. You can see the small holes that were placed in the center so that a string could be attached around them and they could then be worn around the body. This gold piece was no doubt brought by one of the dashing conquistadors from Mexico. This piece probably had 3 lives, beginning as a metal piece similar to these, then being rolled around in a configuration so that it could be used as a fastener to connect 2 pieces of cloth together, and finally in the 3rd stage it had a hole put through it so that it also could be used as a body decoration. This piece on the very bottom of our display table is a familiar one to archaeologists because many similar ones have been found, but interestingly enough, only in the southern part of the state, and so it is believed that it probably had some religious significance or was an insignia of some cult. These 2 pieces are of green stone and not native to our area, so we know that they had to be brought from out of the state, perhaps from the Appalachian region, perhaps also down the favorite trade route of the natives, the Swanee River Valley, by canoe. This unknown metal object, which was obviously European-made, perhaps came from a Spanish musket or from a gunpowder container. A treasure of another kind is this earliest known map of Tampa. It was drawn by Maria Celli in 1757 with north to the left. Tampa was still a wilderness, but as you can see there on the shore of the bay, this is where our city first began.
Right here on the busy corner of Magnolia Avenue and Bayshore Boulevard is where the little fishing village of Spanish Town Creek was located. It really was the genesis of what we now know as Tampa. A short distance from here is located the historical marker dedicated to the village. The fishing rancho was inhabited by Spaniards, natives from Cuba, and a handful of Indians. They lived in palmetto huts along the banks of a stream which still flows today underneath the ground. They were fishermen and sometimes sold their cured fish to passing boats which sailed up these very waters. On occasions, their catch would be sent to the Havana market. During their leisure time, they also made straw hats and baskets out of palmetto leaves. In the early 1800s, a high-born Spaniard by the name of Juan Montes de Oca migrated to Spanish Town Creek. While here, he met a young Seminole Indian maiden, which he described as lovely of soul as well as of person. It was love at first sight, and they were soon married. They had a daughter and named her Victoria. Victoria grew up to be a handsome young lady and married Tampa's second mayor. Their descendants form a part of the Tampa community today. In 1824, President Andrew Jackson ordered George Mercer Brooke to establish a fort at Tampa Bay. Montes de Oca, being proficient in the Seminole and English languages, became an interpreter and guide for the U.S. Army. Fort Brooke was established behind me at the mouth of the Hillsborough River. But then, that's another story for when we meet again next time. Until then, goodbye.
The preceding program was funded in part by grants from the Exchange Bank Corporation Incorporated, the Saunders Foundation, the David Falk Foundation, Tampa Electric Company, Port Sutton Incorporated, the Tampa Tribune and the Tampa Times, the First National Bank of Florida, Tampa Armature Works Incorporated, and Poe and Associates Incorporated.